Hey 8th graders, I'm Ms. Henderson, an 8th grade ELA teacher at Ferndale Middle School, but I'm really excited to be working with you today. For this lesson, you'll need a pen or pencil, your ELA notebook, and your compare and contrast organizer. Today we're going to use our knowledge of compare and contrast text structure to identify the ways that Native Americans were involved in the American Revolution. We're then going to use this knowledge to help you compare and contrast contributions Native Americans made to your American Revolution event. Text structure is the way that an author arranges information in their writing, and authors can use multiple types of text structures in their writing. Compare and contrast text structure describes the similarities and differences between two or more things. And you might see some signal words like although, compared to, however, likewise, on the other hand. Or you might also see lists or Venn diagrams. And it's also really important to understand that as 8th graders, we're reading some more complicated texts, and we may not always see these signal words, but we do want to be on the lookout for relationships between two categories. We often see Venn diagrams when we talk about compare and contrast text structure, and these are really useful, but they're only useful if you're comparing two things. They won't really help us if we're comparing multiple things. So we're going to use this chart because it's going to help us look at some similarities and differences across categories. So first, we're going to look through the text and identify some of the major ways that Native Americans were involved in the American Revolution. Then we'll determine the major similarities and differences between those groups. Then we're going to come up with the central idea. We're going to determine what the author wants us to understand about the contributions Native Americans made to the American Revolution. So while we're reading today, we're going to be on the lookout for signal words, or more importantly, those relationships between those different groups. So to complete this chart, I know that I have to be looking out for the different ways that Native Americans were involved in the American Revolution, and I had to have a text to do that. So I went through and I looked at all of my research resources, and I found this article called American Indians and the American Revolution by Colin G. Calloway, and it had a lot of information about the different ways that Native Americans were involved. So I went ahead and pulled that text, and that's what we're going to read from today. So the first thing that we're going to do is identify any signal words or relationships. So while I'm reading, be on the lookout for that. The Declaration of Independence accused King George III of unleashing merciless Indian savages against innocent men, women, and children. The image of ferocious warriors propelled into action by a tyrannical monarch fixed in memory and imagination the Indians' role in the Revolution and justified their subsequent treatment. But many Indian nations tried to stay out of the conflict. Some sided with the Americans, and those who fought with the British were not the king's pawns. They allied with the crown as the best hope of protecting their homelands from the encroachments of American colonists and land speculators. The British government had afforded Indian lands as a measure of protection by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had attempted to restrict colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains and had alienated many American colonists. Indians knew that the Revolution was a contest for Indian land as well as for liberty. So now we're going to look for signal words and different relationships between Native American groups. The first one that I noticed is that many Indian groups and nations tried to stay out of the conflict, but some did side with the Americans and some did side with the British. So knowing that, I'm going to come up with the central idea of my text now. Many Indian nations tried to stay out of the conflict between the British and the colonists. Some nations sided with the colonists, others sided with the British, often to protect their homelands from incoming colonists. So now that I have my central idea, I'm going to pull out specific comparisons between different groups. So we have that many Indian nations tried to stay out of the conflict. Some sided with the British to protect their homeland from colonists, and some sided with the colonists. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to my chart. We have 3 groups now. And so now we're going to look at different Native American groups that sided with the British, some that remained neutral, and those that fought with the colonists. Let's hop back into our text. Again, while I'm reading, look out for signal words and relationships between different American groups. See how they were involved in different ways. Some Indian tribes went to war early. Cherokee warriors, frustrated by recurrent land losses, defied the authority of older chiefs and attacked frontier settlements. only to be soundly defeated by expeditions from Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. On the other hand, Indians from the mission town at Stockbridge in western Massachusetts, like most New England Indians, supported their colonial neighbors. They volunteered as Minutemen even before the outbreak of the fighting, joined Washington's army at the Siege of Boston, and served in New York, New Jersey, and Canada. Now let's look at our signal words, or how different groups are involved. We have some tribes that went to war early. The Cherokee warriors disobeyed their chiefs and went ahead and fought for their land. Then we had another group in New England that decided to support the colonists. Now that we've pulled out those facts, let's determine our central idea of this section. Some Native Americans, like the Cherokee, fought against the colonists. Others, like the Indians from Stockbridge, supported colonists in the war as Minutemen. So now we're going to pull out the different groups, and that's what we'll add to our chart. So we have the Cherokee warriors fought unsuccessfully against the colonists in the war early on because they kept losing land. Then we also had Native Americans in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, that supported colonists in the fight as Minutemen. And we're going to go ahead and add that to our chart. Let's hop back into the text and see if we can identify any more groups that were involved in the American Revolution. So while I'm reading, be on the lookout for the different groups and how they were involved. The Revolution split the Iroquois Confederacy. Mohawks, led by Joseph Brant, adhered to their long-standing allegiance to the British, and eventually most Cayugas, Onondagas, and Senecas joined them. But Oneidas and Tuscaroras sided with the Americans, owing in large measure to the efforts of their Presbyterian missionary Samuel Kirkland. The Revolution became a civil war for the Iroquois. As Oneidas clashed with Senecas at the Battle of Oriskany in 1777, Iroquois sufferings were compounded in 1779, when General John Sullivan led an American army through their country, burning 40 towns and destroying crops. So now let's look at the different ways groups were involved in this event. We know that the Revolution split the Iroquois Confederacy. Some of them sided with the British, and others sided with the colonists. And knowing that, let's determine our central idea. The Iroquois tribes split during the war. Some sided with the British, while others sided with the colonists. This eventually led to different Iroquois tribes fighting against each other. And knowing that, we can now pull out the different groups that were involved. The Mohawks, Cayugas, and Onondagas and Senecas Iroquois tribes had an allegiance with the British during the war. On the other hand, the Oneidas and Tuscaroras Iroquois tribes sided with the colonists, and we're going to go ahead and add that to our chart. So far we have identified some Native American groups that sided with the British and others that sided with the colonists. And we do know from our earlier reading that there were a lot of groups that did stay neutral, or at least tried to at the beginning. So in this next section, let's see if we can find any groups that remain neutral. So while I'm reading this section, be on the lookout for the different groups that are involved. In the Ohio country, Gayasuda of the Senecas, Cornstalk of the Shawnees, and White Eyes of the Delawares worked hard to steer a neutral course in the early years of the war. At the Treaty of Fort Pitt in 1778, Delawares and Americans pledged perpetual peace and friendship. But after Americans killed White Eyes and Cornstalk and slaughtered non-combatant Moravian Delawares at the mission town of Knottenhooten, Ohio Indians made common cause with the British. They won victories in the West long after Cornwallis had surrendered in the East, and continued to resist American expansion for a dozen years after the Revolution. Now let's look to see the different groups that were involved. We did have these three groups that did try to remain neutral at the beginning, but then after their leaders were killed and people were killed, they decided to side with the British. And knowing that, we can determine our central idea. The Senecas, Shawnees, and Delawares of Ohio tried to stay neutral. After colonists killed White Eyes, Cornstalk, and other Delawares, the tribes sided with the British. So we can go ahead and pull out what we'll put in our chart. In Ohio country, Senecas, Shawnees, and the Delawares initially tried to stay neutral, but then they decided to side with the British after the colonists killed White Eyes and Cornstalk and other Delawares. So we're going to go ahead and add that to our chart. So now that we have our information, we can go ahead and figure out some similarities and differences and determine our central idea. So looking at the information we have and understanding the way the different groups were involved, I can look at my chart and determine that few Native American tribes were able to stay completely neutral. And I can determine that because there's not a lot in my neutral category. Based on our reading, we also can determine that a number of groups decided to side with the British because they had to fight for their land or due to violence from colonists. And then finally, we do know that some tribes chose to side with the colonists due to the relationships they had with those communities. Now, based on these similarities and differences we were able to pull out from different tribes across the 13 colonies, we can determine the central idea. What does the author want us to understand about Native Americans and the role that they played in the American Revolution? So based on this information, the author wants us to understand that many Native American groups tried to stay neutral, but few were able to do that. And many Native Americans fought with the British to keep their land safe, and some did choose to side with the colonists. So completing this chart has helped us understand the different roles that different groups had in participating in the American Revolution. So now that I've walked you through this process, I want you to do the same thing. Look through some of your resources and figure out, even with your American Revolution event, how were Native American groups involved? Were there any fighting with the British? Were there any that were neutral? Or were there any that were siding with the colonists? Then you're going to determine some similarities and differences across groups and come up with a central idea. And if your teacher has not provided you with this graphic organizer, make sure to pause the video and copy it down. Now let's review what we did today. We reviewed central idea and supporting details. We reviewed compare and contrast text structure, and we used our knowledge of compare and contrast text structure to identify the ways that Native Americans were involved in the American Revolution event. So hopefully after this lesson, you're able to determine some of the different ways that Native Americans were involved in your event, and this will really help you when we go to do our research question 5 in our next lesson. Thank you for learning with me today. I can't wait to see you back here for our next lesson.